I think it should be rolling, hopefully. And in your ranking, it asks you ranked. So 1 is your number 1 choice that you would use, 2, 3, 4. Right, 5, 4. In the bottom. As of right now. Also, everybody's grades are fully updated and ready to go for the end of the quarter, unless there's something that you were going for and I missed or something. Otherwise, it should be good to go. Yeah. No, you don't have to answer it. Then you don't have to answer it. You can even put NA in there if it makes you put something in, but I don't think I set it up that you have to put anything in. So. Yeah, 1 is the best, and then from there.
You don't even know if
That would be any other prep book. AMSCO is just an example.
Oh.
But like if you would be willing to go out and get a prep book and pay for it, which is basically, it's a lot shorter. I can show you this version. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. So this is the AMSCO book. So it has like examples and stuff with each section.
Oh, that's scary. That actually really look up anything.
Nope, you don't need to look up anything. So, and this is the 2015 edition. I don't know, they came out with a 2016, but it was late. Like normally they're out pretty early, but it's because College Board changed the stuff like so late. I mean, we didn't get information until almost right before the school year started. So, but AMSCO usually publishes a new version every year, which is why it would be like, you'd probably have to buy it yourself kind of a deal. Because I doubt that the school district would buy these for students, unless we just bought them and just went with the fact that it's not the same right year every year, but which it would be fine. But. Okay. So I'm just gonna kind of walk around to see if we're done, close to being done. In the processes, it looks like most of us are there. Okay. Anybody not get through that yet? Okay, then let's get started into our stuff today. We left off, if I remember correctly, on Friday talking about how World War II is different from World War I in the fact that in World War II, rather than everything being on a voluntary basis, it is now on a mandatory, a compelled basis, right? The government basically says, here's how it is, and this is why it's going to be that way. And that's largely because of the fact that coming out of World War I, right, we had all of this huge amounts of surplus on product, and we had produced and produced and produced and produced, and it was great, but we had this surplus of commodity. And so what happened during the course of World War I, because for the American consumer during World War I, they did not have the ability to buy products. They didn't have the ability to buy goods. And so as a result of that, and as a result of the war itself, you see inflation become massive during World War I. So much so that if you even just look at cost of living, during World War I, cost of living increased 170%. The inflation during World War I was massive, okay? Well, what happens after World War I? The Great Depression, right? I mean, for a while, sure, we had this prosperity, But it isn't very long into that prosperity that who starts to see an economic downturn because they don't have market for their product anymore? The American farmers. You guys are too quiet, like you're afraid of being wrong, but you both were right, okay? Yes, the American farmers, okay? I heard American farmers somewhere over here. I know I'm not crazy. I heard a whisper. Anyways, okay? But the American farmers, they see that economic downturn first, right? Because of the supply versus the demand. Well, FDR doesn't want to go through that same exact thing post-World War II that we went through post-World War I that would once again take us into an economic recession. So the only way to do that was to regulate the inflationary rate. And the only way to do that is to regulate the cost of products. Because you can't regulate the supply, because we need a huge amount of supply of certain things, right? Things to fight the war, whereas we don't need certain cars or whatever. In fact, FDR will go to auto companies like Chrysler and actually tell them not even to make any new model car for 43 and 44. So you can't buy a 43, 44 Chrysler because they just don't exist, okay? They simply don't even exist. There were no model years those years, okay? So what we see is there are some goods and commodities that we don't have, but other things that we have a great deal of, but there has to be that regulation of it because we need those things to fight the war. And if we don't have that regulation post-war, we're going to wind up in another economic recession. So in order to control that, we see the creation of, first and foremost, the Office of War Mobilization, which becomes like an umbrella over all of the other boards underneath it and organizations in order to deal with the war effort. But the one that works most to deal with pricing and labor is the War Labor Board. Their job was to maintain stability, to maintain the status quo. And so FDR says that you cannot raise the cost of food or the cost of rents after what they were in March of 1942. When there's low supply, huge demand, what does that do to the cost? It's going to drive it up, right? And because it drives it up, that causes inflation. So in order to prevent that inflation, we are going to freeze prices here so we can regulate that cost as supply and demand fluctuate along in this market. And so as a result of that then, it will ration and it will limit the amount of goods you can have. You received a coupon book that rationed everything from gas to even the purchase of a car, to the purchase of tires, to flour, to sugar, to coffee, to nylons, to literally anything and everything that a consumer could possibly buy. So if you wanted something above and beyond what your ration book provided for you, either too bad you don't get it, or it would have to be something that you could produce yourself. And so when it came to vegetables, things like that, Americans do go out and start planting what they called victory gardens. And these literally could be in any plot of land anywhere, or a little windowsill, or whatever else. But Americans would plant their crop, or small, vegetables, rather than having to go out and purchase them in the market, which would give them that surplus that then they wanted. But it keeps those things regulated. Now, unlike World War I and it being voluntary, because World War I we had regulated, right? Hoover, under the Office of Food Administration, says, hey, let's have meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. Okay? And then the Office of Fuel Administration goes and they say, let's have heatless, gasless Sundays and heatless Thursdays or something like that, right? But no, it was all voluntary. This is regulated by law. Here is your coupon book based on the size of your family. If you use more than what's in your coupon book, too bad. Okay? Look around your grandparents' homes. Okay? They might have some of these just laying around, leftovers. Okay? They exist out there. I unfortunately don't have any, but I don't know what my grandparents did with theirs. They were like hoarders of everything. So I would assume it's somewhere in their house. I just have yet to find it in their home, but I'm sure it's there somewhere. Because it's forced, because it's compelled, we are still going to have to see the use of propaganda in order to push Americans towards buying into this. But unlike World War I, Americans buy in much easier in World War II than they did in World War I. Okay? World War I, what brings us into the war? Okay, so what things bring us into war? Multiple items. The boats, okay, what about the boats? The sinking of the boats, right? The unrestricted submarine warfare, okay, that's one thing, good job, okay. What else? It's not just about the boats. It must be a Monday today, huh? The Zimmerman telegram, very good. That's another one of those things, yeah. Okay. There's another thing. Has to do with the boats. Nope, it's not the embargo. Well, that would be a specific of the boat, the sinking of the Lusitania or the Sussex. But it's after the Sussex that the Germans write this thing, where they weren't supposed to sink any ships without giving warning in advance. It's named after the second boat. It's actually the third boat, which was a French boat. I said it once. It starts with an S. Oh my, it is a Monday. No. I heard it. The Sussex. Thank you. My goodness gracious. Okay, the Sussex. The Sussex pledge.
We were confused because, like, Clifford thought you meant like the specific treaty.
Oh,
he had already said the name of the boat, so none of us were going to repeat.
Yeah, no. The boat, and then the pledge comes afterwards, and then we have the Zimmerman telegram, right? We have all these things. But is there one singular event that brings us into war in World War I? No, it's kind of a compiled thing that brings us into war in World War I, right? And unlike World War II, in World War I, is the United States directly attacked?
Nope.
No. Okay, I think the closest is there's some submarines that get like within 5 miles of the east coast of the United States, but that's I think as close as they get, right? Which is still pretty close, right? But that I think is about the closest it gets. World War II, what brings us into the war? Pearl Harbor. So there's a difference in the time period between World War I and World War II. There's a change there in how America's going to react, because World War I, the United States is not directly attacked. World War II, the United States is directly attacked. So now we're going to react differently. And Americans, by and large, will agree to the rationing, agree to these forced changes because we were attacked. Now, if we are thinking synthesis, right, is there another time in U.S. history that a similar event has occurred in which the United States has been attacked?
September 11th attacks.
Yeah, September 11th. Well, do we go to war after 9/11?
Yeah.
Yes. Did Americans react in the same way from World War II, post-World War, or post-Pearl Harbor, post-9/11? Okay.
There was still the whole thing with targeting a group of people living within the country that had nothing at all to do with the attacks.
Yeah.
But with World War II, it was more people were happier with going to war. There was less deception. So that's a difference.
Yeah. World War II, Americans largely are like, yes, we'll go to war, and we're willing to give up stuff. On a personal level, I'm willing to give something up. 9/11, did the majority of Americans give anything up, despite the fact that, yes, we did go to war in 2 places, in fact, Afghanistan and Iraq. So did we give anything up?
Patriot. We gave up less physical things.
Yeah, we gave up less physical things. More, freedom, okay, but less physical things. But most Americans don't recognize that lack of due process that exists as a result of the Patriot Act, because most of you will never even see it. Okay, and most of you will never be affected by it. But there's a change then in American history. From World War II to the Patriot Act, there's a change in why Americans would have that kind of a shift. And it largely has to do with Vietnam. So again, when we're thinking about the course as a general, right, you have to remember that things happen in a continuum. Nothing happens and then it's done. Okay, so kind of think about that. But back to this. We mobilized through the War Labor Board to keep inflation at bay, to control and make sure that people were not striking, to deal with how are we going to produce these products. In addition to that, we now need to look at how are we going to build these munitions. And so we see the Army and the Navy begin to go to companies and say, we need you to build this product for me. Now, FDR is smart in this. He understands that it is going to be expensive for the United States and for industries in the United States to shift from a peacetime production to a wartime production. So in order to deal with that expense, he goes to the step of saying, look, I want this to be profitable for you so that coming out of the war, it's easier for you to switch back to peacetime production from wartime production. And I want it to be profitable enough for you that not only A, are you going to be willing to do this, but also B, you are going to be able to pay your workers to do this also. So he initiates what he calls a cost-plus system. And basically what this is rather than the old system of, and what we currently use even in our military, where if we have a bunch of contractors who want to build tanks, they all submit a bid for the cost of building tanks to the federal government, and the federal government says, I want you because you're the cheapest. You're going to build me these tanks. Well, rather than doing it that way, which caused competition and would not allow for the best production methods, he says, all right, I'm going to pay you to make me tanks. I'm going to pay you to make me Jeeps. I'm going to pay you to make me airplanes. I'm going to pay you to make me ships. I'm going to pay you to make me guns. I'm going to pay you to make munitions. Okay? I'm going to pay you to make uniforms. I'm going to pay you to make helmets. I'm going to pay you to make parachutes. And I'm going to pay you to make boots. Okay? And I'm going to pay all of you to switch your production over to that wartime production, and I will ensure that you make a profit. So if you lose money, we will pay out the extra amount to ensure that you're making a profit. It basically is almost like a finance loan, okay, in order to do this. Now, the reality of it is then, is it allows us to switch our gears and then to quickly begin that wartime production. Now, in order to make this continue to work, though, we have to make that determination of who's going to produce what. But it's not a one-time determination, because you may start producing something right now, but maybe you're really, really good at producing uniforms, and I no longer need uniforms, but I need more parachutes, or I need more boots, or I need more whatever, right? So I'm going to then go to you to have you switch again. And so that's why we see the creation of the War Production Board, which was simply an agency that was there to figure out what do we need, how much of it do we need, and who's going to make it. And then not only that, but let me get you the supplies you need so that you can be successful at making the product that you need to make, the raw materials. It is because of that that we will see that Americans will begin to into this shift towards war production. It's also because of that that we will see people use scrap metal drives. We will see Americans push through and create that new industry that's necessary. Because of this, we wind up seeing by the end of 1943, the United States is already creating more product double the amount of what the enemy states, Germany and Japan, are able to produce. It is largely because of this, as Churchill would say, that the United States is able to be victorious and the Allies are able to be victorious over the enemy itself. It will lift us out of the Great Depression and will largely lead to our success. Okay? When we look at this, tanks will replace cars. Henry Ford's plants, one of his plants will be able to create a B-24 bomber, 1 per hour, using the assembly line. Through this, the United States will build over 14,000 ships, 80,000 landing crafts, 100,000 tanks, nearly 300,000 planes, 15 million guns, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, of course 3 atomic weapons, and all the other things needed to fight a war. Okay? We'll also see commercial agriculture increase throughout the United States. Most of the money needed in order to finance that is done through taxes. In 1939, only about $4 million was collected in income taxes. Now, that's from people filing the federal income tax. Prior to 1944, no money comes directly out of your paycheck. In 1944, the federal government starts withdrawing money from you every single paycheck, your withholdings. So if you are a working American, you have withholdings. The government takes your money away. And then if you want any of that money back, or attempt to get any of that money back, you have to file an income tax return. And hopefully, you get an income tax return and don't have to pay in. Now, those of you that are working because you are under the age of 18 and probably making on your own below the poverty line and not making very much money, you probably get everything back. So file by the 15th of April, because otherwise it's money that is just lost and you don't get it back and the federal government gets to keep it. And sometimes it's a couple $100. And when you're a teenager, a couple $100, that's pretty cool, okay? FYI, it can help fund your trip to Washington, D.C. Get your income taxes done. Anyway, if you're an adult, it can be a lot more than that. Now, sometimes you could wind up having to pay in, but it's pretty rare at your guys' age for you to have to pay in. You'd have to be making a lot of money to wind up having to pay in, okay? So, it's pretty rare for you to pay in. But in 1944, we start instituting that federal income tax that's directly coming out of your paycheck. And as a result of that, the United States in 1945 will collect over $50 million in federal income taxes. Okay? That will only pay for about 2/5 of what we actually use for spending of the war, but it does pay for a considerable amount. The majority of the war is financed through the purchase of war bonds, which again, we got that practice out of World War I, right? So we knew kind of how to do this as a result of World War I, okay? And we'll see Americans will largely work through this method as part of that volunteerism, okay? Now, in 1943, at the United Mine Workers, there's a strike that will lead to 450,000 mine workers that go on strike. And this strike was basically because the United Mine Workers believed that they should get more money. And so we see this effort and this continued resistance of hiring women and minorities and the white men wanting to get paid more. And so as a result of this, some of these plants, including these mines that were mining strategic materials, begin to sit idle because of strikes. FDR basically looks at this and is like, this does not help us win the war, so what are we going to do to help it win the war? And so as a result, Congress will pass the Smith-Connolly Anti-Strike Act, which basically makes it illegal for you to strike if you're working in a defense industry. And if you do strike and the mine or the plant is sitting idle, then the federal government can come in and seize the plant. The idea here was it would actually spur on the owners of the businesses to give their employees the raise to prevent the federal government for basically taking ownership of their plant or their establishment. The reality of it is that it basically just breaks the back of the union and breaks the back of the strikers. And as a result of it, it sets a huge precedent that this war will not be about the individual, that it will be about what's in the best interest of the United States as a whole and fighting for the war. His Secretary of Interior largely disagrees with FDR's move, and he actually says that this was a black and stupid chapter in the history of the American Homefront. Because this shouldn't have been something that we were dealing with, and the FDR should not have made and stepped in that way. The reality of it is, though, it does prevent those strikes for the remaining of the war, and it works out relatively well. But even with this, and even with Americans having to reduce the amount of products that they're consuming, the vast majority of Americans are not, their lives are not dramatically transformed as a result of the war. They're not really suffering. The war rations were enough for the vast majority of people. And if you ever ran out of something, it was like you might run out of a little bit of sugar towards the end of the month, and maybe your neighbor would have some extra sugar. You couldn't go and buy extra sugar, but your neighbor probably had a little bit extra that you could borrow from them, or you could simply just do it without a little bit of sugar at the end. And so in the end of it, about 70% of Americans really aren't largely affected by the rationing or by the regulation of their life through war production, etc. Now, Americans do, by and large, decide that as a result of Pearl Harbor, that they want to go to war. And FDR will expand the Selective Service Act to ages 18 to 65 as a direct result of that. 1940 had been the first peacetime draft, but we should see that it will increase dramatically. There are so many recruits who will go into fighting for the war that the federal government and that in their training, they simply cannot provide these men with enough objects to actually be able to do their training. And so when they go into basic training, which typically lasted about 8 weeks of drill and exercise to get them ready to fight the war, some of these men had no experience even shooting a weapon. So having guns there for them to shoot would have been a positive thing. But early on, they just don't have enough guns for them. So they trained using sticks, they trained using stones, they trained using trucks instead of tanks, and they make it work. They make it work for them. But by the end of the war, over 16 million men and women will serve by wars, and including my papa, that's my grandpa there down in the corner. So he was a member of the 96th Infantry Deadeye Division. That's their insignia right here. It's the Deadeyes. And he fought in the Pacific. Specifically, he was both on Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and was part of the island hopping campaign. He was in the Army, though, not in the Marines. A lot of times people give the Marines a lot of credit for what they did in the Pacific. Don't be mistaken, the Army was there just as much as the Marines were, and took as many hits there, too. And also, interestingly enough, I don't know if I told you guys this, but my grandpa met my grandmother at the funeral of her first husband who died, who was one of his comrades who died during the war. And so he was one of his pallbearers, and then he and my grandma started this letter writing back and forth with each other when he got home, and then after a while he went down to Oklahoma and picked her up and took her back home to Wyoming. So, yeah. Grandpa was scoping out Grandma at the funeral. It's odd, but it's hilarious. Okay, so anyways, I always like to throw that out there because I think it's actually a much more common story than it was an uncommon story. You have to realize that even all the strides that women had made up to this point in being more independent, it was still very much considered that women needed a man to support them. And so my grandmother very much was in that same kind of mentality that she would not be able to survive without a husband. So having lost her first husband and having 2 young children that she would then have to take care of, the reality for her was she was going to need to find another husband. Now, wanted to be my grandpa. And they had 2 more boys. So, all right. Of the men that are recruited, there are only 72,000 of that will claim a conscientious objection, and 5,500 that absolutely refuse and wind up being jailed for their refusal of service. Over the course of the war, well over 1 million African Americans will serve with great distinction, and the war would basically be kind of a rallying cry, and it would push the growth of the NAACP quite dramatically. Prior to the war, African Americans had basically 2 times the unemployment rate of whites, and about 50% of businesses would absolutely refuse to hire African Americans. In fact, when it comes to the military, they were not, had separate barracks, separate latrines, mess halls, recreation facilities. You could not be in the Marines, and early on you were not allowed in the Air Force. In the Navy, you were specifically assigned predominantly to mess halls. It was only in the Army where you would see the vast majority of service. But by 1941, there were great protests to try to desegregate the defense industries as well as the defense units. Many African Americans did not want to support the war because of that segregation that existed. And so as a result of that, individuals like Philip A. Randolph would push Americans towards this idea of a double V campaign. He argued that by African Americans fighting in the war in Europe, they could not only gain victory and democracy for those overseas, but they could also gain that democracy for themselves at home, and that in the end, it would help to eliminate racism. It's pretty hard to be very negative about somebody if you're fighting side by side with them. In fact, amongst African Americans, the casualty rates are amongst the highest, and also the African Americans fought with great distinction. This includes in the 99th Pursuit Squadron out of Italy, the 332nd Fighter Group, which was a bomber group. They actually will fly a total of 200 missions, and over the course of those 200 missions, they don't lose a single person, which is absolutely remarkable. They are the only fighter group to not lose anybody in any mission whatsoever at all. It's quite remarkable, actually. They also served in the 761st Tank Battalion during the Battle of the Bulge. And as a result, they helped to not only integrate American bases, but also help to push the American country towards greater integration. They also pushed FDR towards greater integration as well. FDR, in ways, was a very progressive president in the fact that he had opened up New Deal programs to all Americans despite your race or ethnic identity. And he begins to do that even with the armed forces and begins to push for that greater desegregation. He's kind of forced into that to a certain extent, though, because in June of '43, race riots will break out in the United States. This is largely due to tensions because of limited housing, as well as because of jobs and the unemployment rate amongst African Americans being so high. In Detroit, one of the worst of those race riots, over 200 over 25 blacks will die and 9 whites will die, but there's a total of over 200 race riots during that summer. The Detroit race riot takes 6,000 federal troops to put down. As a result of that and the $2 million worth of property damage that's caused in Detroit, A. Philip Randolph basically argues that the African Americans had to have equal access to defense jobs, that there had to be a desegregation of the armed forces and an end to segregation in the federal agencies. And so in order to push FDR towards this, he will organize a march on Washington in March of '41. that march on Washington, D.C. then was basically to demand those previous things. But FDR, not wanting the United States to look like it was crumbling from within during the course of the war, and wanting to maintain a sense of collectivity and a unity amongst our people, he agrees to end the disenfranchisement and the segregation in the defense industry. That is the first demand is the one that he will agree to initially, and he does this through Executive Order 8802. As a result, Randolph cancels the march and largely then becomes known as the father of the civil rights movement. He's often not given nearly as much credit as he deserves as having spurred on the civil rights movement within the United States. The majority of it, of course, is often given to Martin Luther King Jr. But it is A. Philip Randolph who will make the first march on Washington, D.C. And in fact, it's A. Philip Randolph who will lead the vast majority of early civil rights protests in the United States. It's largely because of him that during the course of the war, we will go from a membership in the NAACP of pre-war to 50,000 to post-war, over 500,000 members of the NAACP. And that's all because of Randolph. That has nothing to do with Martin Luther King Jr. And in fact, Martin Luther King Jr. had said that he would not have been the man he was or been able to do the things that he did had it not been for Randolph. So he gives him credit, but unfortunately American history doesn't give Randolph nearly the credit. Yeah. But he does cancel that march. Increased racism only continues to grow in the United States when it comes to the treatment of Japanese Americans. Now, Chinese Americans were also discriminated against, but not nearly to the extent that Japanese Americans were. You have to realize it becomes really hard for the United States to not, or to mistreat the Chinese when we are in an alliance with them in order to defeat the Japanese, right? And so it becomes very difficult for us. So we wind up actually relaxing some of our immigration quotas against the Chinese during World War II. Okay? Did you have a question, Bob?
You kind of answered it.
Oh, okay.
Why did we treat the Chinese and the Japanese badly? Was it just kind of a race thing where we were like, oh, we can't tell them apart, so we'll just do both?
Yeah, it was partially both, but it's worse to the Japanese because of their attack on Pearl Harbor, and because we need the Chinese. We need them as a strategic partner against Japan.
One of the main reasons we went to the war as well was for China.
Yeah, exactly. Because of their continued invasion into China itself. So, yeah, so it makes it kind of difficult for us to do that. But this fear, this yellow peril in the United States continues to grow, and our fear of the Japanese specifically grows. 2 months after Pearl Harbor, a Japanese submarine about 5 miles off the coast of Santa Barbara will fire at an oil refinery near Santa Barbara and hit that oil refinery. In addition to that, 2 nights later, or maybe it was the next night later, there's this 3-hour-long bombardment of LA. There's like where the anti-aircraft bombers went up and basically were hitting the Japanese bombers that were coming in, probably mostly for spying missions more than anything, but they were there. The only damage that occurs is a baseball backstop that's destroyed, but Americans, again, often usually forget about that incident in our American history. But as a direct result of that fear of the Japanese only increases. We truly believe as American citizens that the Japanese living in the United States would align themselves with those living in Japan and would go and help the mother country if there was an attack on mainland United States. And so as a result, we will institute curfews, and then ultimately FDR will sign Executive Order 9066, which moves and creates this exclusion area, which is basically half of Washington and Oregon, and then California and down into Arizona there as well. And what we see then is if you were living within this region, and of Japanese descent, you had to move into a relocation center. Now this was largely the charge to collect all these men was given by General John DeWitt. He removed them into 10 different locations across the United States, which not only included some relocations in California, which Manzanar is probably the most famous, largely due to the book Farewell to Manzanar, but there are plenty of them others as well, as in Missouri, and there's a TED Talk, I'm going to see if I can find it, from George, and I apologize if I pronounce this wrong because I'm not a Trekkie, but George Takei, or Takei, okay, something, I don't know, I'm not a Trekkie guy, I just kind of know who he is, but anyways, he actually grew up in internment camp in Missouri, if I remember correctly, and he talks about in that TED Talk that he was, as a 5-year-old kid, he thought it was really cool because, you know, when he had to go to the bathroom in the middle of the night, the searchlights would, like, guide his way to the bathroom so he wouldn't get lost. Not realizing, like, the reason the searchlight is following you, little George, is not because, like, you're going to the bathroom, it's because, like, they don't want you trying to escape. And the camps were surrounded by barbed wire. They were given, they were given just about a total of 48 hours from the time the order was signed till they were loaded on the first trains to liquidate all of their assets. So they had very, very little time to liquidate their assets, which means that the vast majority of their assets got sold at about 5% of their value. Or, in some cases, they asked their white neighbors to be able to watch their homes, their businesses, their farms, etc. Most cases, though, the white farmer or the white individuals, their white neighbors, just took over the property and took it for themselves. So when the Japanese came home, that property was simply gone. Over the course of the war, then, approximately there will be $105 million in farmland that was lost, $500 million in personal income, an unknown amount in personal savings, as these people are forced into this relocation. They're brought to camps which had very harsh climate and conditions, and the vast majority of the camps were built with what we call green wood. It's wood that's not cured yet, so it's still wet. And so when the wood dried, it created gaps within the houses and within the frames that allowed cold air to blow in. Not such a big deal if you're in Manzanar. It's a really big deal if you're sitting up in Hart Mountain, Wyoming, because it's cold up there in the wintertime. And the structures themselves offered very, very little privacy. More often than not, you were in a large block-style housing kind of structure, and you had basically one room per family, and then the bathrooms were outside, and you had to go basically to an outhouse to go to the bathroom. And shower and bathe and everything else like that. And you bathe with everybody in a group, okay? And as the roofs of these, excuse my poor drawing, this was not closed off, so you could basically, any smells, sounds, whatever, would travel from one residence into the next, and they had very, very little privacy for themselves, which made it very difficult for them. But the vast majority of Americans were loyal. In fact, if we look at this, the vast majority of them, 2/3 of them were Nisi. In other words, they were born in the United States. Whether they were first or second generation, but they had been born in the United States. Only 1/3 was not. And the vast majority of them were loyal to America. In fact, they would often fight with distinction in World War II, having signed loyalty oaths. Over 17,600 will actually be allowed to serve in World War II after 1943. Some of them even in the Pacific, which, interestingly enough, there was always kind of this question of whether or not they would be a spy, and so as a result of that, they were always looked at with quite a bit of suspicion. But they do see different honors that will come to them. The 442nd Combat Team is awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. There are 4 Distinguished Crosses, 350 Silver Stars, and over 3,600 Purple Hearts, which you get if you're injured during the course of the war, injured or killed. During the course of World War II, this suspension of your due process, though, and the due process of the Japanese Americans is upheld by the Supreme Court. Not on one occasion, but on two occasions. In the first occasion, Hirabashi is actually out past the curfew that originally begins right after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. This is before the signing of Executive Order 9066. And he's out past the curfew and is arrested. It is appealed all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that you cannot create a curfew based on a person's race or an ethnic background, that would be a violation of your due process of law, and it would be a violation of basically the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Unfortunately for him, though, the Supreme Court upheld that ruling, or they upheld the decision and allowed those curfews to continue. In Korematsu v. U.S., he argues that you cannot intern a Japanese American unless you can prove that he is unloyal to the United States. Again, there have to be a due process of law here, and you cannot deprive them from their property without proper due process of law, which he argued the Japanese Americans were not given as part of Executive Order 9066. In a much closer margin here than in here, the reality of it was still, though, that the U.S. government upheld Korematsu v. U.S., saying that it represented a clear and present danger, in which they use what historical precedent? What Supreme Court case? Do you remember what acts it is then that gives us the historical precedent? The Alien and Sedition Act, or the Espionage and Sedition Act of World War I. What was the case then that comes out of the Espionage and Sedition Act? Starts with an S. Schenck v. U.S. Remember, Schenck was sending out the anti-draft propaganda and was arrested. Remember that? Yes, no, kind of, so somewhat ringing bells? Okay. It is not until under the Reagan administration in 1988 that he apologized and authorizes Congress to give back $1.25 billion to the internees. It is not until the Bush administration in 1990 that a formal apology is issued and that he actually gives back $20,000 to each surviving internee. Not descendants of any internees, but only surviving internees. And $20,000, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what was lost. It's kind of like, sorry, and about that.
So I guess Japanese license was about $20,000.
No, $1
Yeah.
for the price of the bullet.
It's true, $1. That was
Afterwards, yeah. Yeah, they could. They totally could.